Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, and we're ready for a brand new week of excellent content. But unfortunately, we have to start things off on a sad note. If you recall, Friday, I believe it was, news broke out that the actor who played Black Panther passed away. And this got me thinking a lot about the topic, seeing what people had to say about how that movie affected them. That's, I think, probably his most notable movie. You would think I would have his name on hand when talking about him, but that would require me to prepare for the show. And I have committed myself against that for the purpose of giving you something organic every time. On a serious note, this topic of Black power and individualism, what does it mean? Is there a time and place for a group of people to galvanize and say we need to self-identify as members of this group in order to deal with a problem? And I think arguably the answer is yes, but to what end? I always like to ask, what is all of this leading towards? To what is this integrated? What is the end goal? And I think the end goal, no matter who you are or who your ancestors are, what your features are, the end goal needs to be individualism, or else it's all for naught. You're not going to end the oppression successfully with longevity. You're only going to find a world with more problems and endless problems. You know, we are broadcasting from the Ayn Rand Center UK, and I was always inspired by Ayn Rand, to put it lightly. And one of the ways that she inspired me in my formative years was when I would hear her say things like calling herself a mongrel American. In one of her Ford Hall Forum lectures, she talked about how all these different groups are springing up around America to clamor for favors from the lobby system. But what about just the average, quote, mongrel American? And Ayn Rand said, I'm one too, by the way, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but she referred to herself as a mongrel American. Now, technically, I think she was Russian, part of you can call her the Russian community, the Jewish Russian community. And this was at a time when the Jews in Europe were definitely being persecuted. And Ayn Rand had every opportunity to kind of navel gaze and to talk about how this feels from a Jewish perspective. But instead, she had her sights on the end goal, individualism or death. And that's something that always inspired me, among many other things that Ayn Rand provided. Now, if you sat through this opening monologue, you're in for a reward, because I'm about to introduce a man who has every reason to brag about his ancestors. They actually invented not only science and philosophy, but by extension, all of Western civilization. A man from Greece itself, who is from Athens. And if a movie was made about Aristotle, this man could play Aristotle's friend Steve, underrepresented, undercredited, underrated friend of Aristotle, Steve, who actually did most of the work. No one ever gives him credit. Please welcome Nikos Sotarikapoulos.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. So yeah, we're really sad with the death of Chadwick Boseman a couple of days ago, and we thought that we'd talk. We thought we'd talk about the film Black Panther, but then we thought let's talk about the issue of Black power itself. So many people said that actually, if this film was made not only with Black Panther, quite often with the politics of what we call Black power, a lot of people are saying, and they're right, if you just switched white for black, we would consider this white nationalism. And there is such a thing as Black nationalism. So the first big question that comes forward is the following one. When we talk about figures like Malcolm X or like the Black Panthers Party, they are, to put it very simply, what the woke brigade today would say, problematic. So with elements of anti-white sentiment, with elements of an open Black supremacy, weird links with anti-Zionists, or even with people that today would consider, or even then, Nazis. But here's the detail. The detail is that indeed at that time the Black community was experiencing severe injustice and persecutions from the police. So how did, for example, the Black Panthers become relevant to their communities? By armed patrol of the streets so as to protect the members of the community from the police. And by the way, here's a hint to our leftist friends: try and do some research on where most of gun control comes from. You will find that there's a lot of anti-Black sentiment in arms control, and in most regulations, it's very easy to find some racist undertone, specifically from the progressive end. But anyway, closing the parenthesis. So here's a big issue. When a community has been facing this injustice, is it justified to come together in a national, in a almost tribal outlook and say, look, all of us are persecuted, so all of us come together, and all of us, our politics is based on the group. And for example, with the Black Panthers and with other elements of the Black Power movement, you could see events of official segregation, or not segregation, of exclusion. So for example, this is an event for only Blacks. But because historically, this was a time of injustice, they get a pass. And the question is this pass justified or not? My initial reaction is not, but let's see what Rucka has to say.
I mean, you said that today's woke brigade would consider Malcolm X problematic, but that's obviously not true, because Malcolm X's type of philosophy prevails and enjoys a seat at the table of woke politics. Because when they say white people, they mean capitalism. That's ultimately what it boils down to. You can be the blackest 100% African Black man, and if you're pro-capitalism, pro-individualism, you'll be called all types of horrible names, like you're not really Black. Like you'll be compared to like a slave who begs his master to keep him a slave.
Uncle Tom.
An Uncle Tom. I didn't want to say it, but you're obviously the fiery, feisty Greek with the uncontrollable tongue. Now, with that image in mind, let me sort of push back a little bit. Now, arguably, there is a time to say this particular group of people are being oppressed, and we need to galvanize. We need to identify as this group of people. Like the 19th century, the Jews looked around Europe and said, look, no matter how much we try to assimilate, no matter how we just try to act like average Joes, they won't let us. So let's call ourselves Jews and leave Europe. That was the Zionist movement. I mean, there's probably a lot more variety in the sort of theory that went into it. And that was kind of the problem from the start. Yaron Brook has a lecture, I think, called something like The Rise and Fall of Israel. And it starts with the Zionist movement. And I think he points out in it that from the start, there was no clear end goal. What is the end goal of Zionism? Is it to have a socialist utopia? Is it to have an ethno-state type place? Is it like, what is it? Of course, what they needed and what everyone needs today is an individualistic, capitalistic country with rule of law there to protect the rights of the individual. And then you can forget about the racial element of it all. But unfortunately, that's on nobody's radar these days. Those days are in the past, sadly. The founding fathers are only ghosts today. There's almost nobody advocating for individualism. But if you do have individualism as the end goal, the question remains, is there ever a time to galvanize as an oppressed group? And I think, yes, the argument can be made, yes, with that end goal in mind. So if you're living in the United States in the 1950s, in the South, or even in the North, I mean, I like to remind people the lobby system, which came from government regulation, it hurt Black communities in the North. So obviously the Jim Crow South is a blatant image of systematic racism. But what about the lobby system in the North when it's time to pave the roads? When the government assigns itself to pave roads rather than leaving it up to market forces. Who do you think the government's going to give better roads to job opportunities downtown? White neighborhoods predominantly or Black neighborhoods? In other words, which community do you think has better connections in the government? Obviously, it shouldn't be up to who's got better connections. But if it is going to be that in the early 20th century, it's obviously going to be predominantly white neighborhoods. So again, I'll repeat myself. The question is, if individualism and capitalism is the end goal, then is there the argument made in the meantime to say Black power, and meaning stop oppressing Black people? And the argument can be made that yes, there is a time to temporarily say You know, I'm a black man and I am grouping together with other blacks to push back against this oppression, to call attention to it and to end it. And then we can live in a liberated, liberty-based society and ultimately assimilate, you know, That's kind of that's my sort of bridge that I present people with. That's often a bridge too far for many people. I think ultimately the end goal should be assimilation, because as nice as it is to be able to say, oh, this tradition has been in our family for 1,000,000 years, how does that benefit anybody's life? And when you fall in love with somebody that you want to marry and they're not part of the tribe, who does it benefit for you to walk away from that opportunity or any other opportunity? If you want to leave the country you were born in, go live somewhere else, why should you stay in the town you grew up? Why should you stay in the country you grew up? There's really no reason. Every individual should pursue the life that they want. I just gave you a lot to respond to, so go ahead.
No, it was so interesting what you said about Zionism and about which I think so the issue is on the level of self-protection. Yes, it makes sense to organize based on what is the persecuted group. Obviously, if you're a Jew in the 1930s Europe, it doesn't make much sense. You know, it makes much sense to have self-defense teams and all that stuff because you are the persecuted in an environment of anomie. But here's the thing, though, and that's why I don't get why Malcolm X gets a pass, or maybe I do know. So, for example, last week we saw LeBron James in a picture which I'm happy to pay half a month's salary that it was staged. You know, he was reading Malcolm X during his workout. Now, here's what was Malcolm X's Nation of Islam, some of its key points as you can find it online. Black people are the original people of the world, whatever that means. White people are devils, blacks are superior, and the demise of the white race is imminent.
He was being symbolic. He was being metaphorical. I'm joking.
Right.
I don't know why.
Symbolic. He was metaphorical.
No, well, listen. Okay, you can finish your point. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was about to say, yeah, they're gonna give us exactly this line. No, don't take it literally.
No, I don't know if they would, but they would say. I mean, people defending him would say, look, in his context, that's what he saw, and I would defend Malcolm X even more than that because I have the tools to say. Malcolm X living 100 years after Frederick Douglass, you can see when each one of them gained the opportunity to study what was available to them, what was presented to them. Frederick Douglass was still living with the remnants of the Enlightenment, and Frederick Douglass actually named himself Douglas after a Scottish poem. Isn't that beautiful? The Scottish Enlightenment was still reaching a freed slave in the 18 whatever decade it was that he gained his freedom. And 100 years later, roughly, Malcolm X also grew up in the midst of systematic racism and a lot of voluntary racism around him, meaning private citizens being racist towards him. He went to college or he opened books, and what did he see there? Socialism, collectivism, the individual can't truly be objective, critical race theory or whatever it was called at that time. I mean, this is why philosophy matters. So I would sort of even stick up for him in a way by saying, like, well, what do you expect him to to discover objectivism before Ayn Rand is done inventing it? I mean, Atlas Shrugged wasn't even published till 1957. By then, Malcolm X, I think, is already like a cooked adult.
He's already in the Nation of Islam. But here's the thing, though. It wasn't the only option. At the same time, for example, do you know who was really pissed off with Malcolm X, by the way?
Martin Luther King?
Yes, and many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, because they said, look, we want assimilation. And if you do some research, they say, oh, you know what? There is a middle road. And the middle road, they called it something like balanced and humane ethnocentrism. Which, again, having done research with the alt-right, these terms sound a bit weird to me. Because they're saying, oh, no, we're not saying we're not going to hurt anyone. Just, some ethnocentrism like Israel, you people like Israel as opposed to us who don't like. So why do you support Israel and why not have a white ethno-state? So what I'm saying is that if we cut some slack to these views, Actually, I think this is an act of racism. Here's why. Because you consider that that person cannot know any better. So why, for example, don't we cut some slack to Marcuse? Why don't we cut some slack to white leaders who, okay, they didn't feel the oppression of that Malcolm X had experienced. But again, if you're such a great guy and you're such a leader, I don't accept the excuse that there was no other way. And the question is this: has this movement, has the movement of Black nationalism contributed to a better life for Black people, or has it made it worse?
Depends who you ask. Depends who you ask. I mean, there are people, I mean, they would see a Nation of Islam man with a bow tie and a suit who has a purpose, who has a sort of integrated worldview. We might call it misintegrated, but still a purpose and a function versus a sort of aimless, Black guy that doesn't like really have a philosophy or anything like that. That would say, yeah, see, Black liberationism is good for us. I mean, a philosophy is better than no philosophy or something like that. Like a religion is better than pure nihilism or just sort of a floating aimlessness in a void. I mean, it's ultimately a question of where are we headed? Are we headed towards individualism, or are we headed towards collectivism as an end in itself? So I think when it comes to like Israel, the extent to which they are successful comes from their Enlightenment values, comes from their elements of individualism, of capitalism. It's sort of the elements of Israel that are sort of in contrast with their sort of stated mission, which is, a home for the Jews. It's the fact that it's Greek, I like to say, the ancient Hebrews fended off a Greek invasion, but today what makes Israel a place worth defending morally is the fact that they're Greek, that they brought Western civilization into the region. And the problems with Israel come from the contradictions, come from the collectivism, come from people saying that that the Jews living amongst each other is an end in itself. I don't think that's a recipe for success, and it's not going to benefit anyone, not whites, not Blacks, not the Irish, not the Greeks.
Well, yeah, and anyway, I'll say it anyway. I don't think that anyone is going to benefit by these kind of voices becoming the dominant voices. It's guaranteed, because there is no chance you can have one kind of ethnocentrism, quote, without another kind of ethnocentrism. And the end result is going to be a society where we're all segregated in our lines and in our ethnic boxes. And there can't be a most boring world to live. Well, the world that I'm contained to what is perceptually, oh, here's a Greek, here's some gyros. I love these things, right? I get tears in my eyes when I think about Greece. I don't want this to be the final horizon of my life. And the same happens with any kind of tribalism, ethnic, cultural, whatever. And indeed, this community the Black community has experienced severe injustices. Happy to go to the barricades with them. I'm not going to the barricades with Malcolm X, because if Malcolm X wins, tomorrow is not going to be much better. I don't want to substitute one kind of collectivism for another type of collectivism. When is the time that two types of collectivism are going to clash? In the US elections. Have you decided who is worse?
I mean, I keep saying like Trump needs to go because what he represents in the long term is just an absolute nightmare. But then like I see the riots and I'm like, you know what, maybe like Trump's not so, like, even though like Trump isn't doing anything about the riots either way, but it's basically a battle of symbols. It's like you're voting for the riots or you're voting for an authoritarian in the big picture. It's like, well, which is worse? I don't know. Like, can we just cancel the presidency?
We're all on the same boat. And here comes the Ayn Rand Center UK to the rescue. So in around 40 minutes, the Ayn Rand Center UK is hosting a discussion with two prominent American objectivists, Andy Bernstein and Bob Stubblefield, not on who is better to vote for, but we reframe the narrative. Who is worst? Who should you vote against? And each one of these, again, prominent American objectivists are going to take one side of the argument and someone else is going to take the other side of the argument. I don't know if we're going to vote at the end, but I think it's going to be a very good discussion. and it shows our predicament that it's as you said, it's almost impossible to decide which collectivism is worst. And the same, I would say, is the case with ethnic and racial collectivism. I don't like white nationalism. I don't like black nationalism. But anyway, so tune in on Facebook Live. Ayn Rand Center UK is the page, and you can follow the discussion beyond the traditional way through the meetup. Rucka.
I've got a thought that occurred to me recently, and maybe you agree. The reason I think we're so sensitive when we hear white people talking about galvanizing, and obviously the phrase white power is much more upsetting than any other. Obviously, there's the historical context, but in another respect, average white guys in America, they're kind of like the Republican Party. And I don't mean just because they vote Republican and that the Republican Party is full of white guys. I mean, like people in America that have not galvanized as part of any group, they're sort of like the last hope for individualism. And to see them turning to collectivism means like that's our last hope is gone. Similar to the Republican Party, with all of its faults, with all of its lack of principles, it's still sort of the last hope for capitalism when compared to the other major parties. So that's why.
About that, because I don't know which group, if it makes sense to count this way, holds the more collectivistic views. But I get what you say about the Republican Party, and again, this is why I'm a bit more bitter with black nationalists, because the seed of the good ideas was there. Again, Dr. King. That was a man with enlightened ideas, even more socialist voices, like Du Bois, for example. They didn't like this idea of ethnic segregation. So it shouldn't have gone that way. It could have gone a different way, but it didn't, and that's sad. But anyway, we are
another day. Yeah, we'll continue this another time. There's a lot more to say about this.
We'll continue another time, and again in 35 minutes, join the Ayn Rand Center UK on this discussion.
And thank you, by the way, my Greek friend, for reaching your hand across the ocean and telling us Americans how to handle our racial problems. We appreciate it.
Yes, I'm Greek-splaining to you, and beside the usual Rand-splaining that we do. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.